Hello, this is Matthias Goetz. This is my monthly COVID update. Who or what is the contamination? It is maybe a contamination not by virus, but by ideas, values, misunderstandings, humans. It's a contamination by humans. Okay, so 1st of August 2022. Welcome. I've as a just opening thought, I have many times said we need to be critical and clinical in our thinking. If you were wondering where that comes from, it comes from Gilles Deleuze, important 20th century philosopher, one of the most important, who had the following to say, and he says this about artists and writers. But in some ways, we all artists and writers. We're writing a narrative here about so-called COVID. And the art is in puzzling together, putting together the puzzle of, you know, what it is, what it does, and what's going on. Right? So what Deleuze says about authors applies to us. Have a read. We are now the clinicians of civilization. Start with Russia. Very briefly, there's not much to say. The front lines are stuck. I think one of the main things that happened in the last months is that Russia now reduced gas supplies to Europe by 75% in volume. In other words, they're now shipping about 25% of what they used to ship this before February. So that's a quarter. But since prices are 4 times as high, the total revenues that Russia obtains from gas shipments to Europe are the same as they were before February. And profits, which are revenues minus cost, and cost now for them being much, much lower because they're shipping much, much less volume, profits are through the roof. And it is the profits which the government skims off and then allocates to things such as waging war on Ukraine. The second effect, of course, of the reduction is that the Europeans are getting very, very worried about the forthcoming winter and scrambling to find alternatives, to reduce usage of gas, to find new sources. But that's really, really hard in the short term. And the winter is only a few months away now. So Russia has been extremely clever about this. They're basically getting the same revenues as before. They're getting much more profits out of those revenues. And at the same time, they're scaring the EU or the Europeans to hell with what they're doing, and putting a lot of pressure on them. And Putin had, from the beginning, said those impositions that the Europeans and the Americans and others have made on Russia, sanctions, that they would backfire and that especially the Europeans would suffer more than maybe the Russians would. And there is some truth to this. And that's what Putin is now demonstrating. So that is not surprising, but interesting to note. Obviously, Putin is also trying to, again, to split the Europeans. That has not really succeeded so far. Hungary, his key ally is maybe the wrong word, but relatively friendly nation within the EU. Hungary is rejecting many of the EU proposals as to how to deal with the energy crisis, but that's only one member. Ultimately, Hungary cannot really derail the EU's efforts, especially since many things are actually on a local, national basis or bilateral basis between member states who have to, for example, negotiate offset agreements or sharing agreements. If one country runs slow in winter, then maybe the neighboring country, if they are running a bit higher, may help, etc., etc. But that all has to be negotiated. But Hungary cannot really stop that. They may be able to slow it down a bit. So on the whole, Russia has not succeeded in splitting Europe, but it has certainly succeeded in scaring the European populations about the forthcoming winter. I mentioned before, people like my mother heat their house with gas, and you cannot just simply switch. I mean, she's not gonna at age 86 all of a sudden put solar panels on the roof and or whatnot. And even though solar panels probably wouldn't suffice to heat her house anyways. So yeah, in the short term, for this coming winter, there's trouble ahead. So that's really, I think, the main thing that's happened. Yeah, in terms of the fronts, I mean, Russia has made some gains in the Donbass. Apparently, Ukraine has made some glacial gains near Kherson and also up there in Kharkiv, but basically not much change in terms of the front line. Okay, some clippings. In the city where Europe starts, ethnic Russians start questioning Putin's war. This is actually about a Russian minority in Estonia. As you know, many former East Bloc countries, or Soviet Union countries, when they split from what is now Russia, retained significant Russian minorities, when Russian-speaking minorities, and so did Estonia. But what is really interesting about this to me is that they're saying in this border town of Estonia, which is populated mostly by Russians, they say Europe starts here. No, Europe starts at the Ural Mountains. That's the convention for many hundreds years, and let's not change that convention. Russia, in a very significant way, is also part of Europe. And when I read these things, I mean, this is part of the reason why Putin is waging this war. Right? It's because he feels excluded, he feels ignored, and he doesn't like that, and he's that type of ego, right? So that's a personal matter, but there's truth to, I mean, generally the Russians who support him, it's not just Putin, it's many millions of Russians support him, feel neglected and rather pissed off by disregard, especially given the contributions they've made to Europe, which are quite unquestionable, these contributions. But they feel that, you know, outside Russia and a few other places, nobody heeds or pays attention. Maybe that's the reality. People have a short memory and they don't remember history. They don't remember the sacrifices that Russia made. Maybe that is just the reality, and maybe Russia just needs to wake up to that reality. But, you know, to publish these articles, that's, even if it's just one guy, you know, saying this, why quote this, right? Or why not quote it at least as a critical annotation? Right? No, Europe doesn't start in this little town of Narva in Estonia. Europe starts in the Ural Mountains and the Caucasus Mountains. I guess what I'm saying is I keep seeing things that make me sympathize with Putin and his ilk against my will. Right? That's not necessary. Yeah, I think this article, again, I just picked it up because of the language. Air war, remember? We were waging war on COVID-19, on coronavirus, 2 years ago, and apparently some people are still waging this war. Right? And this war may go on much longer than the Ukrainian war, which itself will go on for, unfortunately, a very long time. Fragile armed peace at the moment. So this is the Institute of Global Health. I mean, how do they get to this kind of language? Right? We're talking about something very trivial here, which is a common cold virus. And they're using this martial language, and it just doesn't help. I mean, the reason I pick up these articles is because they pop up. Right? It's not like I'm making this up or I'm searching deliberately for this kind of language. No, it just pops up, left, right, and center. Why? New Omicron strains better at dodging protection from vaccines and previous infection. This is back to the people not understanding what they mean by protection. I think a lot of people think of protection, oh, you never catch the virus. If your protection means you don't catch the virus. No, wrong. Protection means you don't get ill. You can catch the virus as many times, and it doesn't matter. As long as you don't get ill, it doesn't matter. Right? Protection means you don't get ill. And there's no indication whatsoever that any of the new strains make you more ill or anything like that. They don't. So they infect you, yes. And I mean, the headline is, in a way, so redundant, right? New strains better at dodging protection. I mean, if we leave aside the lack of definition of protection, right? What they mean is they're better at infecting people, even people who have had another variant before, who have been vaccinated. And the answer is, yeah, of course. Well, there's no need for an answer. Actually, there's no need for this headline. Yeah, of course the new strains are better. Otherwise, they wouldn't exist. Any new strain that comes to our attention is by definition better at transmitting. Otherwise, it wouldn't survive. This is competitive. Viruses are much more competitive than humans, who are rather uncompetitive at this stage. They're in constant competition with each other and with the other 200 common cold viruses and other viruses like influenza viruses that also colonize our upper respiratory system. There's a huge competition going on up here. They better be better at transmission, at infecting people. Otherwise, they wouldn't exist. Right? So by definition, they're better. So this headline is completely oxymoronic or redundant. Right? It's a tautology. Let's put it this way, not oxymoronic, but tautological. But this is not helpful. Right? Why doesn't someone go up and just say how it actually works? Nobody does. For 2.5 years almost now. Wow. Monitoring app cuts travel history scrutiny. I just love this. This is a good thing for everyone, as someone says. This is basically the most complex personal surveillance system ever invented by humankind. And this goes way beyond anything that George Orwell or the other types who came up with these dystopian scenarios could have imagined. I mean, you are being basically tracked by your government in China on a daily basis. They know every one of your moves. That's all under the umbrella of, oh, we have to win the battle against COVID. Yeah, I mean, what a godsend gift to the Chinese leadership, who basically wants to just simply control 1.45 billion people like puppets. And here you go. They're all tethered by invisible tethers to the government's databases, which we all are, all humans are nowadays. We're all tethered by invisible tethers to government databases, but nowhere else to this degree, I would think. This is quite unprecedented. And people go and say, oh, this is such a good thing for everybody. And I think they mean it. No, they are not joking. Within their little box, that is true. Yeah, they mean it. Birth rates, yeah, just one data point. As you know, I keep, just when new data pops up, I just bring it to you. As I said, it will take many years to really understand how birth rates have been affected by this so-called COVID crisis, if they have been affected in the longer term, which we don't know. But I mean, one thing interesting here is that if you go to 2019, and rather go, let's say from 2014 or 13 to 2019, and just imagine drawing a line through that. I didn't do that. No, I could have drawn the line for you, but I forgot. Just think an imaginary straight line, which is just sort of a correlation curve, right, through those last 4 or 5 years. And you can see it's quite steeply dropping. Yeah, it was sort of at 1.8, 1.85, and it went down to something like 1.65, 1.7 in 2019, right? Let's say 1.7. And then in 2020, the COVID situation hit. And as we already knew, birth in the US significantly dropped. So you can see that the drop in 2020 is steeper than that previous trend line, right? But then now the new data is that in 2021, for which we now have the 4-year data available, they came back up. So if you extend your imaginary correlation line, let's say from 2014 all the way to 2021, you will find that 2021 is pretty much exactly on the trend line. So this preliminary, and again, this is preliminary, this may be a blip, next year may be different again, but the preliminary data is that in the US, there has been no impact on birth rates in the medium term. I mean, the short term, yes, but it was already, by now, it's already more or less compensated. So we're already back to being on that trend line, pretty much, almost anyways. Yeah, so, I mean, and that we talked about it, that was the case after World War II, for example, in many countries, during World War II, birth rates pummeled it, and then right after the war, they came back up significantly and compensated. And we're basically back on trend. And we may see the same here with COVID, but it may differ from country to country, and it's still too early to really tell, but I thought this is an interesting bit of information to share. Here's our good friend, Mr. Fauci again. He still keeps talking, even though he has nothing interesting to say. If you were infected during the first Omicron wave, you don't have a lot of good protection. Again, I don't think he knows what he's talking about, what he means by protection. And again, same as earlier, yeah, no, you don't. I mean, if you mean by protection that you cannot catch the virus, then no, there's no protection against catching the virus, zero. No, I mean, no effective. I mean, yeah, you can wear a mask 24/7, but it's still, you have to eat, right? During that moment, the virus can still catch you, right? So there's no real effective prevention from being infected by this virus. And that isn't, and the point I've been making for the last 2.5 years almost, there's no need for it. There's absolutely no need for it. And that's why nature has it so that there is no protection. Because there's no need for that protection. It would be a waste. Mr. Fauci evidently doesn't understand that. Does an early infection give you protection against severe disease? Yes, not a full protection, but probably a significant advantage, right? Plus, I mean, it may not just have been one infection. You may already by now have had 2 or 3, right? And the more the merrier, right? Because the more often you're exposed and your immune system learns about the virus, I've said it all before, the better for you, right? So your protection in terms of being protected against severe disease actually goes up with every encounter. Even when they're new variants, they're not that completely different than the old variants. If they were so completely different, then we would call them a new strain, as we have with influenza. And that then would raise the fatality rate again. Yeah, if that happened, and it could happen, but hasn't happened. But as long as these are just variations on the same virus, very unlikely that the next encounter is riskier for you than the previous one. And in fact, the opposite is usually the case, even though you're getting older. But important is that you don't have huge time lags between those encounters, because then you get a lot older. And then the age, remember, it's your immune system that is the real factor, not the virus, right? And so you don't want to have big gaps between your encounters with the virus. You want to meet the guy in all its variants, frequently. That's the best strategy for virtually all of us with a very small section of the population. That would be a few percent. That would be 20%, even if you're conservative, who probably better off not trying to expose themselves to the virus. But the vast majority of the population globally is better off exposing itself. Yeah. I think this is here is similar, evading. So at least this article says, while the new variants are catching you easily, you still seem to be protected against severe illness. So at least they're giving that factual information. Right? It's a bit hidden in the long text, but at least they do that. I mean, these articles are quite useless because they all just reinforce what's basically obvious. Right? Every new variant will be better in infecting you, and will be able to somehow bypass your first sort of defenses here and get you anyways. But it will be ever more unlikely to accidentally get down into your lung, where you don't want to have it and where it doesn't want to go. Right? So, I mean, the good news, it's just getting easier and easier with every generation of variant. Right? It's only that our measures make it harder for our immune system to adjust. But that's a man-made problem. That's what all these articles should not be talking about the virus. The virus is completely clear what it is doing. And there's no need for these articles. It will be much more important to actually talk about our behaviors and our immune systems, how they work, and what that means for our behavior, which is don't wear a mask, don't isolate, don't do social distancing. But that nowhere does that pop up in the news. Nowhere. That is the most amazing thing I've ever experienced in my entire life. For 2.5 years, almost 2.5 years, nothing but misinformation about something that is very simple. It's just unbelievable. I still can't fathom why this is happening. Another one on the new offshoot, it's called BA.5, but I don't even bother to remember the names or numbers they give to them now. What? Oh, people who had been infected as recently as March or April found themselves infected again within a few months. Yeah, that's not very likely, because you do seem to have, for a few months, you do seem to have even a first order protection, and meaning it's at least for a few months after infection, it seems relatively unlikely that you catch the virus again. But it's not, the likelihood is not zero. Of course there will be cases like this, right? But again, that's so obvious that it doesn't require an article. The result is that we're getting sick in droves. No, that's wrong. Most of these people are presumably not sick. Right? The vast majority of people who are catching this new offshoot aren't sick. They have a cold, or they have no symptoms. And they talk about the true disease burden. I mean, there's all this vocabulary that is not true. There isn't a very significant disease burden. Yes, of course. You might say, hey, but aren't there thousands of people in hospitals because they really do require hospitalization, because they really do have pneumonia and really truly sick? And the answer is, yeah, that's true, but not in any way to a degree that our healthcare systems couldn't cope with that. That's why we have them. Right? This whole talk about, in droves and burden. I mean, these wordings. It is not true that lots of people get sick in droves. First of all, the data clearly shows otherwise. We'll talk about the data in a moment. And the true disease burden is probably significantly lower than people make it out to be, whereas the overall social burden, societal burden, economic burden, etc., is much, and political burden is much, much, much greater than people make it out to be. So we are barking up the wrong tree. Our healthcare systems are coping fine. Yes, of course, for a few weeks in Italy, in the mountains near what's the town, and up in the north, they probably really do had a crisis of hospitals being filled with sick people and couldn't cope. But there will have been a few other places. Maybe New York did have a crisis for a while. I mean, there were a few places where things really came to a head. I mean, that is true. But by and large, for the vast majority of places in the world, that isn't the case. But politically and economically and socially, all of us, 8 billion people, have been massively impacted by this. And we don't, I mean, not by the virus, by the policies. And we don't talk about it, as if that is taboo. You're a conspiracy theorist if you dare to talk about it. World Health Organization, my favorite club, warns, they're very good at warning wonderfully against apathy and efforts to contain COVID-19 in Africa. Lax enforcement. Most of Africa has no issue with this. They have more important fish to fry. Most of their populations are young, have no issue with this. Yes, I mean, if they are severely malnourished, for example, or severely, lacking certain, vitamins, vitamin D, certain other things that may really weaken their immune systems, there's a problem. But then that's a much more fundamental problem than COVID. And that if people don't get enough quality food, that is a problem. But then don't blame COVID on if these people then can't cope. That's a problem that the politicians have, the national decision makers have caused. Right? If there's hunger, for example, or if there's malnutrition, that is a real problem. And we all know that if you're not properly nutrified, you are more susceptible to illness. I mean, yes, but that's not unique to COVID. This is not the worst thing they encounter in some countries. Yeah, but that people are malnourished, that is a real problem, of course. Yeah. But that's not the World Health Organization that is primarily to be the ones to be addressing that. That's the politicians in those countries where that happens. Here's a nice one, because I've been talking about all the side effects, negative side effects of all these government initiatives, including vaccinations, the COVID vaccinations. And here's one that is, I didn't mention this one before because I hadn't even thought of it. I just could see that there are many, right? And here's a nice example of one. Right? Those vaccinations that children should really get, because they're really known to be effective and useful, they're not getting right now because they're instead getting vaccinations that they don't need. Now it's funny, not funny, it's the usual thing that, the pandemic is behind this backslide. No, the pandemic is not, if it doesn't exist, and it is not behind anything, it's policy. It's behind this thing. Policy makes this so. Bombshell. Oh, okay, this is a different topic, but I just bring it up because it is somewhat related to the same type of stupidity. Now, this study funded by this foundation, well-known people, finds that alcohol has only risks and zero benefits for adults. Now, I highlight in the text, they specify a little bit what they mean by zero benefits. They mean zero health benefits. For naturally, these young adults feel that alcohol has some benefits for them, otherwise they wouldn't use it, right? Maybe it's tasty, maybe it's enjoyable, maybe it's a social thing, you know, it improves their social life, etc. So maybe this alcohol actually has a lot of positive benefits for these young people, but not in the health, not strictly in the health. But this doesn't even cover mental health, I think, because actually there's a strong hypothesis here that alcohol up to a certain degree, right? Up to a certain degree, alcohol may actually benefit your mental health. It makes you maybe happier, more social, more engaged, more, at least to some people. Right? I wouldn't exclude that possibility at all. Right? So, and that's not just for adults, but also for young adults. But there's no talk of this here. The study was purely, I think, focused on health in the sort of physiognomical sense, bodily functions. Yeah, then nobody should expect that alcohol has benefits in that sector. I know there's been some talk about a glass of red wine may lower your risk of heart attacks or heart failure or something like that. I mean, there are some, but that's the correlation, as far as I recall, wasn't very strong, and and no really scientific explanation could be given for the phenomenon. Now, it doesn't mean the phenomenon doesn't exist, but as long as you can't really figure out, well, why would that be so? You have a right to be a bit skeptical about those kinds of things, and especially if the data isn't that conclusive. So I think it is very prudent to assume that no, from a pure physiognomical bodily health perspective, no, don't expect any benefits from alcohol. Don't kid yourself. But there may be societal benefits. There may be even mental benefits within limits in consuming alcohol. Alcohol is very often consumed in a social setting in a group. Not always, unfortunately. When some people sit alone at home and drink alcohol, they probably have no benefits from that. But it may have significant value, including to young adults in a wider sense, right? And the problem with these studies is, this is where the funding goes, right? Very well, foundation, do good, right? We are trying to save the world, save the health of humanity, but they're not actually doing that, right? Because they're always looking at a problem from a very, very, very limited perspective. So they find that, don't expect that you have these types of health benefits from alcohol, and then you go like, yeah, of course, nobody should expect that. I mean, who on earth ever said so, right? No, of course you don't have these types of benefits, but you have all these other benefits that they're not talking about. So it looks like so much wasted money and effort. Now, to be fair, it's always good to reconfirm your hypothesis, right? So if I had the hypothesis, I would have had the hypothesis. If you had asked me, I would have said, no, I don't think there are any health benefits other than the mental health benefits and social benefits I talked about. But and then you might say, yeah, so this study confirms your hypothesis, Matthias. Yeah, great. As if I'm surprised, right? Now, I'm a bit cynical here. Maybe one day we will find some reason why alcohol in certain measure can do certain positive things to you, right? Maybe. But I mean, the risk associated with alcohol, well known, right? By far the most dangerous drug on this planet for humans, by far, right? Kills more humans than just about anything else in terms of in the drug world. And actually by far more. And so that's all understood, right? So the risk of taking alcohol, even initially in a measure, in a small measure, because there's always a risk you escalate over time. Right? I mean, those risks are very well known, right? So, I mean, nobody in their right mind would argue that, oh, those risks that are very well known are offset by some kind of dubious health benefits. No, 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 they aren't. No, no. The reason so many people enjoy alcohol is because they enjoy alcohol. They enjoy the community, the social aspects of drinking alcohol. They enjoy the taste. They enjoy the being slightly on a high, right? And without too much of a short-term risk compared to some other drugs. So people enjoy this, right? And that's human. People are just being human. These kinds of studies always tend to treat people as if they were robots, right? Sure, if I was a robot, I wouldn't aspire to drinking alcohol. As long as you oil my wheels, I'd be happy. But I'm not a robot. Right? So this is such a narrow tunnel vision of and such an obvious finding. It's just disappointing that don't we have more important things to think about? I mean, this is one of the best funded foundations in the world. And I just wonder, I mean, it's very nice for Mr. Bill Gates and his ex-wife, to give their money to research. I mean, that's admirable. But I really haven't seen a single piece of research coming out of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation that I thought was interesting. So maybe it's just a fancy way of throwing away their money. Anyways. COVID-19 is surging in the US again, but warnings by officials are muted. Well, I highlighted one sentence, no reason for residents to let the virus control their lives. Remember, I've said this a few times now. This is quoting Mr. Trump. Don't let the virus control your lives or dominate your lives, I think he said. This is basically almost a verbatim quote of Mr. Trump. They don't seem to realize that. Because nobody nowadays wants to be caught quoting Trump. But Trump said this a few times now. Trump said the most intelligent thing of any politician anywhere in the world about this COVID situation, right? And now slowly some other people, without knowing it, are starting to see what Mr. Trump saw 2 years ago. Yeah, most Americans are meeting a new COVID wave with a collective shrug here. No, especially since, the seasonality is in the US, you will see in a moment, is not that different this year than in the previous year. So people have been there, seen that, except it is lower, as you would expect, right? So, I mean, people may not know all the things we know, they may not have the empirical data nor the thinking behind it, but they have a sense, a common sense. The common sense just tells them, hey, I mean, it wasn't that bad last time, and this time it's probably even less bad. And why bother, right? That is a very, very healthy human behavior. I wished more countries, more people in different countries would have this kind of, nonchalance, this ability to move on. Right? I think the Americans largely have that ability more than most other people. Yeah. So good for them. Okay, here's another topic which occasionally I bring up. The reason I bring up climate change is because there are so many similarities in the lack of thinking between the climate change so-called crisis and the COVID so-called crisis. And I thought this was rather shocking and interesting anyway, whether shocking or not, but interesting. And I hadn't thought about it this way, but I'm not quite sure about the numbers that are being thrown around here. But basically, they say there's a study, a large-scale investigation, showing that 48% of children and young people interviewed said they're worried about climate change, or about the impact of climate change. 48%. And that is, I mean, ever since World War II, I would imagine that there could not possibly have been a generation of young people so worried about something. Some people may have said, oh, I'm worried about the future, or whether I get a job, or, you know, blah, blah, blah. But 48% young people are worried about something of which it's not even clear that it actually exists in any meaningful way. I mean, climate changes all the time. Yeah, so of course climate change exists, but whether there is something here that gives us reason to be worried is by no means clear. Right? I've been talking about that on a separate previous occasion. We'll not do that now, but I just wanted to throw this up. Right? And another study, I think, 45% of the interviews said climate anxiety and distress, I mean, these are strong words, anxiety and distress, is affecting their daily lives and functioning. And almost half of those who said they talked with others about climate change felt ignored or dismissed. Now that's interesting. If 45% are worried, then I mean, at most half, you know, half of the people they talk to should not be worried, right? Because the other half should also be worried, right? If they are randomly selected, maybe they are not. So, or maybe they are being missionaries here and trying to convince others also to be worried, and then they feel ignored or dismissed if the other person refuses to be worried. Now they may, if that is the case, and these people may want to think about maybe the other person has a point, not to be worried. Right? And I mean, I've a few months, a couple of years, a year ago, I've been in a brief conversation with someone about this by email conversation. And I think there was a bit of this, right? Because that person was very concerned about some floodings in Germany that were unusual, and oh, it's climate change, and you know, aren't you worried? And I'm like, no, and I could find several other reasons why this particular flooding occurred, and you know, unusual number of people drowned. And I think that person also felt ignored or dismissed because he was like evangelical. He tried to convince me that, oh, no, this is climate change, this is so bad and it's so dangerous and you must see that. And I'm like, well, no, because I've not, and I told him, I've not seen a single article in my entire life that was intelligent, that talked intelligently about climate change. And I told him, for example, that what I shared in one of my videos here a while ago, I told him that our current temperatures are well below the long-term average on planet Earth, and we have data, you know, which is calculated based on assumptions, but you know, it's pretty robust, I think, you know, pretty well done. We have data 350 million years back, or even more, even 500 million years back, and we know that our current temperatures are well below the long-term average. We are in a relatively cool period, right? And even the projected massive increase of several degrees Celsius only brings us nearer to the midpoint. Now, I'm not saying this is trivial in the sense that, because it's happening very fast, right? This is a very fast rise in temperatures, and of course, life on Earth needs to adapt to it, and some life forms may not be able to adapt to it. But in the bigger scheme of things, and this is always my point, right? Before you jump to some conclusion, you got to understand the bigger scheme of things. You got to understand the context. Where are you coming from? Right? From the point of view of planet Earth, there's nothing unusual about where we are right now and where we are heading in the next 100 years. We are well within the normal parameters. And the other thing I told him is that as far as the evidence goes that we have, hotter periods had higher degree of biodiversity and biomass. Meaning there was simply more life and more diverse life on this planet whenever it was hot. You know, above average hot. We're still below average. Yeah? But above average hot, from a point of view of life as such, is a good thing. Life on this planet at least insofar as the past is concerned, that we know of, the last 350 or 500 million years, life thrived on this planet when it was hot. But people just take a very, first of all, a very human-centered view. It's all about us. They don't really care about life on planet Earth. They just care about our way of life today. That's the other thing. Not only do they care only about us, but they only care about what they know as it is now. For a lot of people, good means no change. Just as if we are living in the best of all possible worlds, to quote Leibniz, and any change can only be negative. Right? That is the attitude a lot of people who are in this climate anxiety camp, I think, take. Oh, things are getting worse and worse and worse and worse. But there's actually no rational argument in favor of that. If you take the broader view. Yes, some people, some individuals, some countries may be affected in a negative way, in a certain way. They may have to invest in certain things, yeah. But those are all the details, right? But if you look at the bigger picture, it is totally unclear what positive effects, for example, the rise in temperatures may have. Right? Nobody's even trying to talk about that. That is again very shocking. It's so one-sided, prejudiced, human-centric. It's just the same as with COVID. Right? Oh, this evil virus, we have to go to war with this virus. No, it's actually about our immune system. Right? But the wrong perspective. We needed a Copernican revolution, remember? And for climate change, we will need another Copernican revolution. And I'm afraid we will not get it. We didn't get our Copernican revolution for COVID, and I don't think we're going to get one for climate change. Right? We're just going to continue talking the same talk. Nobody sits back and says, let's do some thinking. Just nobody. And why? You're not being paid for it. I mean, I don't get anything for trying to do a bit of thinking. It's not fashionable. People don't want to hear it. Too complicated. They just want to hear the mainstream arguments on Instagram, right, or Facebook. Right? They don't want to think for themselves. It's way too tedious. Plus, they don't have money thinking, right? So they don't. Right? You don't get paid for thinking. Your employers don't want you to think either. And they basically want you to follow orders and execute. So thinking is not in fashion. But it's a very expensive choice not to think. I mean, we are going to spend an amount of money on climate change that will dwarf what we spend on COVID, right? What we suffered or what we've lost in terms of losses on COVID, which were tremendous, right? But they will be chicken feed in comparison to what we're going to waste because of so-called climate change. I mean, the numbers are so big that nobody can even fathom, right? And there's nobody responsible, again, right? Already with COVID, including the governments who suspended our constitutions, they are not responsible. Nobody takes responsibility for it, right? With climate change, it will be even worse, right? Nobody will take any responsibility for the hysteria that is gathering, right? And you can see that hysteria in this kind of a statistic, I think. 48% of young people are worried about climate change. Either they don't really know what it means to be worried, or they aren't really so worried. I mean, most young people have more important things to worry about, right? Or if they are really deeply worried, then that's a worry. How can we have 84% of our young people be worried about something that we don't even really know, does it exist? How to define it? Yeah, there's something there. Obviously, temperatures, I said this before, temperatures have been rising on this planet for the last 50 or 70 years. That is an empirical fact. Right? But what that means beyond the fact that temperatures are rising, there's no concept, there's no definition of what it means. And nobody even is attempting to define it. Right? But people are worried. Right? Of course, people are worried always about things that they don't understand. So, but we keep talking about climate change, even though we don't know what we're talking about. Right? That I think is something that worries people. young people who hear that every day, they get worried. Or they think they're worried. They don't really know why. And the answer is because we are force feeding them this worry. Every day talking about something that is intangible. I don't mind at all that we talk about climate change, but why don't we talk intelligently about climate change for change? But that apparently isn't happening. Austria mourns suicide of doctor targeted by anti-vaccine campaigners. Yeah, so apparently a doctor in Austria committed suicide who was on the radar screen of some of the more, vehement opponents of government policies. Now, first of all, you have to understand that Austria had quasi-Nazi style policies. I mean, worse than most countries in Europe. And I saw it myself. I was there last winter, and it was quite terrible. And it affected people. I mean, you got shouted at if you had your mask not properly on your nose or something. I mean, you got like bullied left, right, and center on the ski slopes. I mean, it was terrible. I mean, all of a sudden I was not longer surprised that Hitler came from Austria. Yeah, I'm sorry to say that, but I mean, that's exactly the kind of country where someone like Hitler would come from. Yeah. I mean, it was shocking. The majority of Austrians, and I think that's not only the Austrians, I think the Germans too, and some others, are basically Nazis. Deep at heart, they're basically Nazis. They terrorize you. They have like zero respect for your individuality. They have zero respect for your personal choices. And so there were, let's say here at the bottom, tens of thousands of people marched in protest against lockdowns and vaccine mandate. Austria got very close to making vaccination mandatory. That would have probably been the biggest crime in Europe. I mean, specific crime in Europe since maybe the Holocaust. Making vaccination, basically forcing you to be raped. Government forced gang rape. They just last minute stepped away from it. But there are some people in Austria who realize what's going on. Yeah. Now that this doctor died is a sad thing, and sorry for that. But I think they should maybe have an article about those suicidees who committed suicide because of the government policy, because of these types of doctors who took, as they say here, a cautious approach to the pandemic, which means she was probably a Nazi. A Nazi being someone who has zero respect for individual choice, zero respect for the integrity of another person, zero respect for the dignity of another person. That's what I mean by Nazi. Right? I don't know this woman. I don't know the case any further. But if they say here that she took a cautious approach to the pandemic, that basically means she was a Nazi. That doesn't mean she should commit suicide. But yeah, I'm still waiting for some articles about those people who truly suffered from these policies. But those articles are not forthcoming. New Zealand's border fully open. Yeah, so after only 2.5 years or so, yeah, finally you're actually allowed to travel to New Zealand again. My gosh. A staged and cautious process. Remember, I showed, what's her name, Ardern with Hitler mustache 2 years ago. And I won't take that back. She deserved the Hitler mustache unreservedly. A staged and cautious meaning, Nazi-inspired process, keeping our people safe. No, you're exposing your people to a lot of risk by not allowing them in a regular fashion to be exposed to the virus. Now, okay, now after 2.5 years, they're starting to be, hopefully, be exposed to the virus. It's very hard to know how big the effect is of that 2.5 year delay. It's very hard to know. clearly conceptually there's a quite significant effect because everybody has become 2.5 years old. But that's significant, right? I would expect that in the long run, the IFR in New Zealand will be higher, measurably higher than a priori you would have expected it to be. Right? In other words, that very many people will be dying because of these restrictive measures, because they've been prevented from getting to know the virus. New Zealanders eventually will want to travel again, and the virus is out there, and whatever variant. So, so if we did a very long-term study, probably it would have to be 20 years or longer. We would find, and it's my prediction, but I don't want to call it a hypothesis because I'm not going to go and test it because it would take 20 years to test. But my prediction would be that New Zealand will end up having unusually high fatality, unusually compared to maybe other countries with similar GDP per capita and so on and so forth, similar healthcare system. Let's say countries like Sweden, Norway, Denmark, countries of roughly the same size and roughly in a similar climate zone, etc., right? So similar GDP per capita. So, but those countries, none of them were ever fully restrictive like this, like New Zealand was. Right? So you would expect in the long run to see a divergence. Of course, in the short run, New Zealand's fatalities are bound to be lower than those countries I mentioned, but over time, they will end up being higher. But I will not try to prove my point because it would take a really long-term study to do that. And you could argue maybe that, well, but at least those people who could have died in the last 2.5 years and didn't, at least they gained some years of life. Yeah, that's true, but at what cost, right, to everybody else? Remember the other 99% who wouldn't have died, no matter what policy. Yeah, at what cost? And Macau is to reopen the city as no COVID infections, they mean SARS-CoV-2 infections detected for 9 days. They must wear masks everywhere they go and show negative coronavirus tests for entering any venue. And it's the first time that Macau is grappling with the Omicron variant. This is really interesting, right? Because Macau is even behind New Zealand in this. Right? So what I just said about New Zealand is even more true about Macau. And Macau is this tiny island, overcrowded with people, a few 100,000 people, permanent residents there. And they're basically in this prison, right? They're not only cut off from the rest of the world, but they're also cut off from the mainland. They're completely locked up on their tiny little island. And that may be the case for years to come. I mean, one wonders whether anybody will want to stay in Macau. Of course, there's some people who never travel, so they will be, okay, I don't care. Yeah, those will stay, right? But, I mean, if you're young and you're in Macau, I mean, you better get out. Fast. Yeah. So for the next, I don't know, 100 years, whenever no infections are discovered for a while, they let you go out of your house with mask and with tests. And as soon as some infections are found, you're back in lockup, right? But it makes no big difference because on your tiny little island, you're anyways locked up. Brave new world. Welcome to Macau. I hope you're not a gambling person because you will not like this. Yeah, glass night. Let's breathe. And welcome back. Let's talk about COVID. Yeah, still in the fractured world, no big change. We seem to be heading back towards something like an early spring for a couple of months, but then we stalled, and since we've been treading on the same spot, or even move backwards a little bit. No change from last month. Yeah, infection level is rising very gradually. Now we're at 94%. Reported cases are now growing faster than my calculated cases, but that's just because my calculated cases are only basically first-time infections, whereas reported cases, of course, include second, third, and fourth infections, right? So they can grow faster than my number that I'm interested in. Right? But so it's gradual now, as you would expect, as we approach 100. As I said a long time ago, the curve inevitably has to flatten, and that's by definition, because by definition that I use, the number cannot go above 100%, right? And it cannot, realistically speaking, ever hit 100%. It will always be slightly asymptotically approaching 100%, but below it, right? So, we expect that this number now is very slow. It may accelerate a little bit in winter, of course, but still, it's basically now a flat curve, given where we are at. To some degree, the same is true for fatalities, because the calculated maximum 40.9 million COVID fatalities, meaning people who die actually of pneumonia in conjunction with SARS-CoV-2, pneumonia, or maybe some other organ failures. There's a complex set of things that can happen once you have a pneumonia, and you don't actually die of the pneumonia, you die in conjunction with that pneumonia. So really, this 40.9 million are people who die in conjunction with the pneumonia, which is in conjunction with SARS-CoV-2. Anyways, keep it simple, right? So we're gradually approaching that number, but the 40. Unlike the 100% on the previous slide, the 14.9 is not written in stone. 40.9 is a calculated number based on the assumption that the IFR globally is 0.23%. Now, if I have to change that assumption, because new data suggests I have to, and I will, then this number 40.9 will change, right? So in that sense, this is not a hard sort of ceiling as on the previous slide. The previous slide, by definition, cannot go higher than 100%. On this slide, we could go higher than 40.9, which would just simply mean the IFR is a bit higher than 0.23%, which may yet turn out to be the case. And as I said before, our measures may even over time drive up the IFR rather than down. I mean, the natural tendency would be for it to go down, and it will go down. But our measures, insofar as they delay the natural progression, they may keep it higher for longer. And in some countries, I just mentioned New Zealand or Macau, it will even force the IFR higher than it would have been otherwise. Now, these are small countries. They won't have any impact on my model. China would, but I excluded China from the model. So, so far as the big countries are concerned that drive this model, there's not going to be some significant effect of the type that I just described in conjunction with New Zealand and Macau. So what I conceptually can argue will happen in New Zealand will not affect the model, because New Zealand and similar countries like Macau or Hong Kong are just simply too small to make any difference in the model. Yeah, mapping the progressions of seasonalities. In Sweden, nothing too surprising. Germany, similar. US and the UK. Now, let me first of all talk about the US. I mean, you do see that the US is always a bit off cycle, and I tried to explain that before by saying, yeah, they have different climate zones. It's a very big country, and so different states go through the seasonal cycle at a different time. There may be other reasons. Last summer in August, you also had this situation that actually the numbers were quite slow, but then sometime in like late August or early September, late August probably, they started rising again quite significantly. So this is really, compared to the European numbers, it's unseasonal, right? But I just wanted to highlight, we seem to be heading the same way again this year. So this seasonality in the US, which is a bit different from the European countries I'm tracking, this year seems to be going in the same direction as last year. So there's nothing changed. Now compare that to Sweden, where last summer you had really no low figures. And the Swedes did travel. I mean, they didn't travel in droves, to be fair, because people were just holding back. But there were no significant restrictions to travel. So some people did travel. But this year is significantly higher. Now, that's probably explained by just more people this summer really going all out and, going to party in Mallorca and Ibiza and so on. And, catch up with the things that they would have otherwise done last year, but maybe chose not to. So there's certainly that sort of summer travel effect here. But yeah, it's still, I wonder whether that's the only explanation for the numbers in Sweden now apparently going up, unseasonably, meaning before we're really getting to the autumn cycle. And the same in Germany here, you see, right? The numbers are now above the green line. So they're, as they are at least temporarily here in Sweden, right? Germany, they're very clearly above the green line being the conceptual prediction. The US is a bit different, as I said. And then the UK also has a spike here. Now, again, UK also traveling heavily. So Sweden, Germany, UK, all similar in that, summer vacation in July, August, a lot of intermingling, a lot of partying, a lot of going out, meeting people, and therefore, of course, a lot of potential to get infected. So even if the virus lies low in summer, you just have a lot more contact points, at least from the human activity point of view. And so maybe this is just an effect of now all the restrictions having gone and people now more or less pursuing their normal summer activities. And there is such a thing as, summer flu as well, or summer colds, right? So we know that. So to some degree, that's probably just this very active life that people are having these summer months. So maybe this is unsurprising, and we just didn't see it last year because people didn't hold back with these activities, whether or not the government policy imposed it on them, but they were holding back. However, let me put up a hypothesis, and hopefully we'll be able to at least, if not really fully test it, but at least track a little bit what happens in the next couple of months. Let me propose that the Sweden, Germany, and UK data may suggest that the original seasonality of SARS-CoV-2 is being partially eroded or dissipated, meaning it's becoming less focused on the winter months and conversely somewhat more active in the summer months. Unlike in the early stage where the seasons, as I showed, were very pronounced. And most likely, if that is really the case, if the blip that I just described is not just a matter of people are traveling all over the place and being very active, but if we can find there's really the seasonal pattern we originally saw is starting to be dissipated or eroded, the best argument at the moment I can think of is that it is the new subvariants doing that. Remember I said before, the vaccinations forced the virus into faster and more varied mutations, right? They're imposing selectional pressure, evolutionary pressure on the virus, because it is in competition with other viruses who are not being attacked, so to speak, or countered by a vaccination. Remember, this vaccination is unique to this one cold virus and does not affect the other 200 cold viruses. Mask wearing or lockdowns are different. They affect all these viruses equally. But vaccination only affects this one, right? So it lowers its competitiveness against the other 200 cold viruses. And in trying to survive, the virus therefore is under a lot of selective pressure or selectionist pressure to mutate faster, which those other 200 viruses who have been around for a long time are not under the same pressure because they're fairly established. They have their market shares, and the market share of our upper respiratory system doesn't vary maybe that much. Although I'm sure there's some shifts from year to year, from season to season. But our SARS-CoV-2, because it is new and because it has to fend for itself, and because it is attacked by these vaccines, or not attacked really, but its life is being made harder by the vaccines. It is under greater pressure than all the others to mutate. And one of the ways in which SARS-CoV-2 could seek to regain a competitive advantage is by becoming less seasonally dependent. How exactly it does that, I don't know yet. So I don't know. This is just an initial hypothesis. But maybe we are seeing here the emergence of, empirical evidence in the data that I just shared, that the new variants of Omicron, whose numbers and names I don't no longer bother to remember, but those new variants, maybe they've already found a way to better compete by spreading in those summer seasons in which other competitors, other cold viruses, tend to lie low. And because the reason they are seasonal is because they find transmission easier in winter than in summer for various reasons, right? Which have to do with our human behavior and health, general health, and so on. Right? They find it easier to transmit in winter than in summer, and therefore it's efficient for them and effective to lie low in summer and go all out in winter, right? But if every virus pursues the same strategy, and within that same strategy, this one is disadvantaged because of vaccinations, then this virus might change the strategy, right? It might just go after the summer months, even though it is a bit harder, maybe to be caught by a human being in summer than in winter. There's a lot less competition for the same real estate, right? So your yield in terms of infection yield, if you're this virus, is higher in summer than in winter because there are far fewer competitors around that are active. At least that's a theory, right? That is somewhat, I think, plausible. So what I want to see over the next couple of months, I want to track this data, as I anyways do, and see whether really we've gone a bit off seasonality. That initial strong seasonality we saw is sort of going away. And if so, then we would have to argue, well, this virus has become less seasonally dependent. And the best reason for that would be this competitive pressure and the virus's mutation in such a way that it can be more effective during those seasons where all the other viruses lie low. It would make a lot of sense, right, if you're this virus. We'll see. Yeah, this chart, okay, like last time, we're now down to Sweden and Germany, and then the new normal countries who still have a long way to go until they reach full herd immunity. I mentioned before, with Sweden, this is surprising because they've always been quite open. And it could support my theory that because they were open to the virus from the very beginning, and the early stage was probably really important, the first year, because Sweden was open to the virus and then the subsequent variations, Swedes may on average have been actually infected more than most people, not less, even though this data seems to suggest, I mean, the infection ratio that I've calculated with my normal method seems to suggest they've been less infected. But that may actually be a problem with my approach and with my model, with my concept, rather than the Sweden. It is possible that the IR is actually much higher because the IFR is much lower than in my model. And my model is still using basically a priori IFRs calculated based on certain demographics, right? Especially age and so on, right? As you know, it is not post hoc, right? It is not a posteriori, meaning I haven't gone back, and it would be very difficult to do, and say now, given what actually happened in the last 2.5 years, how would that modify the IFR? And arguably, Sweden is, if my basic assumptions are correct, Sweden, having been very open, should have been coping with the virus better than many comparable countries in Europe, for example. And therefore, in my model, it shows the lower IR because the IR is based on fatalities. So basically, fewer Swedes are dying. Why? Because of the intelligent policies early on, which gave people early on an opportunity to expose themselves. Now, that's quite a stretch at the moment because I have no real good data on Sweden to support that. How much the virus really circulated in Sweden early on, I don't know. While there were no official top-down policies, or only relatively few, I said 2 years ago, maybe the Swedes are very good at being self-disciplined and keeping the distance and, respecting other people's concerns and so on. And it's, it's a country that is not so densely populated outside maybe Stockholm and a couple other big cities. So there are things going for Sweden that, might just have helped them keep the actual IR low. Yeah, I cannot exclude that, but there is a possibility here that Sweden really demonstrates that the power of having been open from the beginning, allowing the people to get to know the virus early on. Right? They did have significant fatalities early on, more per capita than many other European countries. But as time progresses, their position becomes ever more favorable, remember? Because they don't have that aging effect. Because if people were exposed early, and in other countries they're only exposed a year or 2 or 3 years later, that makes a significant statistical difference. So, in other words, this is to be taken with a grain of salt. Germany is also to be taken with a grain of salt because the reason the numbers reasonably low is that there was quite some increase in vaccinations, but I don't know from the last months, but I don't know how sustainable that really is. Maybe linked to travel, summer travel. A lot of people say, maybe before I go travel, maybe I should get a booster. Right? A lot of these are now like 3rd or 4th shots, right? Booster shots. Yeah, so it's a bit, uncertain whether these 8 months are not underrepresenting. So same in Japan. Japan has a similar effect, and Japan actually has a significant increase also in terms of IR, because at the moment there are actually, it's quite active in Japan. Yeah, Korea, as expected. Thailand, actually the number has gone up a little bit. That's because both IR and VR are growing very slowly at the moment in Thailand. To some degree, that's because almost 100%, well, let's say 90% of Thais actually wear masks, even though it's not mandatory. That would slow down the virus quite a bit, right? And it would then possibly increase the risk in the longer run for people who haven't been exposed or have only been exposed once, which is maybe not enough. Okay. Yeah, nothing new here, nothing new here. Well, I should say that these IMF figures about economic loss were very preliminary, done in, I think, mid 2020 or so. So to be taken with a grain of salt. The damage may have been much bigger than this. Nobody maybe is not going to calculate it. In terms of numbers, I've just bumped up the excess mortality to around 20 million. Remember, I had like 19.8 or something. The Economist claims their mid value is now 21 point something. But I've always said I find the numbers a little bit high, and I don't have comparable numbers from other sources now. As I said, maybe at the end of the year or early next year, we will do another round looking at this, because usually early in the next year, some institutes will publish something about it, but for the time being, I've just sort of put it round number, and then we gradually increase this number a bit towards the end of the year. But I don't think most places now these numbers are growing faster than the reported the reported fatalities. Because largely the restrictions in most places are gone. So there's not such a big reason why the excessive fatality would grow faster than the COVID fatalities. So I'm going to maybe just gradually increase it, maybe lock it to a certain percentage of, COVID fatalities being a certain fixed percentage of total excess mortality. So say something like 71, 72, or 73%, which is sort of in the ballpark that I've observed in the long run over the last 2 years that I've been tracking this. We'll see. Yeah, but it's not a big change. Basically, we're getting, based on my calculation, we're getting quite close to the point. We're now below 1 million people who have actually been saved by government policy relative to the predicted 40.9 million that we are predicting will die. So we're getting closer and closer to that number. Of course, as we close in on 100%, this is the equivalent, right, in fatalities. So when we reach 100%, then this number will have become zero, right? So we are gradually reducing the number of people saved, and we're gradually increasing the number killed, or at least by now, maybe just more or less keeping it flat. And so what we've seen is that in terms of man years, and remember I made assumptions about life expectancy. I've reduced the average life expectancy for those people who were killed, but from 25 to 20 years. Maybe just assuming that quite a number of these were people who were elderly and needed healthcare, didn't get the proper healthcare because of the COVID measures. That may be quite a significant chunk of them. But these are finger in the air numbers anyways. But just taking those reasonable guesstimates, 20 times as many man years were destroyed by government policy than were saved. And remember, I used to say it's at least one order of magnitude. Yeah. This is now 20. One order of magnitude would be 10, effect of 10. We are now at effect of 20. That is very significant. The vaccination mania, there's not much change here. The vaccinations are now down to a bit of a trickle. Couple of 100,000 per month that I added. So other than some elderly people in Europe and such places getting boosters, and in some countries still campaigns being run, like Japan, for example, but largely people are no longer getting vaccinated. So maybe my estimate that we would have tens of billions of vaccines handed out was an overestimation. Finally, long-term scenarios. Yeah, a little bit of just tweaks. I mean, one thing I had said, well, maybe we are seeing the youth gradually moving into the metaverse, where they are self-realizing in a disembodied manner. But when you look at the data about the anxiety, the climate anxiety, 84% of people being worried, and 48% having genuine anxiety about it among young people. I mean, they can go into the metaverse not only to self-realize, they can also go into the metaverse to self-abandon. Right? Both are possible. I mean, there's well-known stories of Korean boys who basically lock themselves up into their room 24/7 and no longer existing outside the little room in the internet world. I mean, you know, that could become a more widespread phenomenon. So I've put the use in the middle between self-realization and self-abandoning, because the realm of infinite possibilities is also a great place in which you can get completely lost. And at this stage, frankly, I'm not so sure. Are they going to self-realize, or are they going to self-abandon? And I guess the answer will be both, right? Some will go north and some will go south. But proportionally, which one will be the bigger group? I hope it's going to be the North group, but at the moment I'm a bit uncertain. So I've put them in the middle bar here for now, until further reference. China, I've put a bit deeper into The Walking Dead, because even though I've been saying ever since, you know, March 2020, when the president went to Wuhan and raised his hand, remember, that China was basically going the Walking Dead way. But you know, until a couple of months ago, I was always thinking that, wow, but aren't they going to turn the corner? I mean, New Zealand has now turned the corner. Taiwan has sort of started to turn the corner. I mean, you maybe start with Hong Kong, maybe let them turn the corner first and see how it goes, but aren't they going to do something? I mean, are they really going to continue on the zero COVID path? I mean, forever? Yeah, but for example, the Macau data is very clear. Yeah, the only reason they allow people out of their house is because they haven't had cases for a number of days. Yeah, so that's zero COVID policy is alive and kicking in Macau. I think it is alive and kicking in Hong Kong. They're trying to lower the quarantine time in some kind of complex way, with, you know, under certain circumstances, in certain conditions, you can now quarantine, you know, only 5 or 7 days instead of whatever 10 days, to you know, encourage some travel. And but basically, I think in Hong Kong the zero COVID policy is still in place. And I mean, those would be the logical test beds for Beijing if they wanted to at least start testing an alternative. But there's no sign of that. And so I've moved China deeper into The Walking Dead, because I really have this impression, as long as Xi Jinping is alive, and I'm not here to predict how long he's going to be alive, China is just going to be deep into The Walking Dead zone. Yeah. I've also added China in the bubble with Russia, because Russia, with the invasion, is, you know, pursuing a sort of a new romanticism, or really a nationalism. So it's not really not the same thing as fundamentalism. It's a bit of a misnomer, but I subsume it here, because there's a bit of a romantic notion about what Russia stands for. Right? So in Russia now is in this mode where they try to reassert themselves as a great nation, and there's something slightly romantic about that, I think, although it's got nothing to do with early 19th century romanticism, which was quite cosmopolitan and not national typically. This is sort of a nationalistic variety of romanticism. But the reason I put China into the same bubble is that, well, I think there's a real possibility that China, looking at what's going on with Ukraine, decides to invade Taiwan. What do they see in Ukraine? Well, yes, there's some significant local resistance, yes, and foreign powers are delivering weapons and other things. Yes, that is something that one has to reckon will happen, no matter how often China reiterates that no other country has any right to interfere with their internal matters. And since they define Taiwan as an internal matter, therefore nobody has a right to interfere in Taiwan. But what they see in the Ukraine is that foreign powers, Western powers, do intervene, right? Make it a bit harder, right? So that's one lesson learned, right? But they don't enter into a war. So whatever activities the Western countries are doing in Ukraine, they're always well below a threshold at which they would trigger basically all-out war, right? So that is a learning for China, because they can assume the same will happen in Taiwan, right? If they invade Taiwan, yes, the US and some other allies will send weapons to Taiwan, but will they go to war with China? No. Right? They won't. Right? Now, China isn't exactly like Russia. China doesn't have those scary long-term intercontinental ballistic missiles that carry multiple warheads, right? China doesn't have those yet, although I suppose they're probably developing them. I mean, long-range delivery capability. They already have nuclear weapons, right? So warheads, but they don't really have yet, maybe, or not in significant ways, long-term delivery capacities. But they're probably working on that, right? But as soon as they have that, they will be just as untouchable as Russia, right? And even before having that, they are quite untouchable, because they certainly can reach Japan, South Korea. And so if the US, for example, made any noises to go to war, Japan would be like, don't do that. So I don't think they would sacrifice Japan. I mean, the Americans. Oh, no, I didn't think Russia would invade Ukraine. So, I don't have a track record of getting political predictions right necessarily. Who knows, right? But I personally, I think that China is looking very carefully how the US and the Europeans are reacting to the Ukraine. And what they see is basically, well, it's ugly. It's, if Taiwan gets some support, they're formidable. Yes, it will not be that easy, other than using, non-conventional weapons, which I don't think the Chinese would want to use against the so-called fellow countrymen. So it will be a bit of a, ugly, there will be fatalities, but in the end of the day, they will, just like Russia will get the Donbass, China will get Taiwan. And at the end of the day, no major power would go to war over that issue. That's what they're learning, which means it lowers the threshold for them to launch an invasion of Taiwan. And so I put them there as a question mark, because that is potentially in the cards in the next few years. Not so far off. Well, with that sober thought, I leave you to it. Take care.